Let's get into it with my next guest. Joining me is author of Uncovered: How the Media Got Cozy with Power, Abandoned Its Principles, and Lost People, Steve Krakauer. Steve, thanks so much for coming back on the U.S. Report. The big story to me out of the press this week has been just incredibly biased reporting about Israel and the conflict with Hamas. And I'm looking at an NBC News headline: "Death and trauma stalk Palestinian children." And this is just the sort of thing that we're seeing constantly, where, Hamas are turned into the victims and the Palestinians are turned into the victims. And what's happened to Israel is turned into, something that was almost sort of justified. What's your take on how the media has been covering the conflict with Israel and Hamas?
Yeah, it's really unbelievable. Although I think at this point we shouldn't be surprised anymore about these sorts of things when we see it. I think there's two different categories of the terrible media coverage that I think is at minimum anti-Israel and at maximum more anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. I think there's the subtle ones. You pointed out a good headline there: the focus on the Palestinian death toll. Really no mention at all of things like the hostages, hundreds of hostages still under Hamas's control, or the atrocities of October 7th. But it's also the reliance on things like the Palestinian Health Ministry or the Gaza Health Ministry for treating that as if it's legitimate and not telling viewers and readers that it's actually Hamas run, and very often overinflates and completely spins and propagandizes the media. And they just continue to go along with it, even though they've been proven wrong multiple times, including the hospital bombing, which became this huge story. So I think we're seeing a lot of that. We are seeing some elements of really overt anti-Semitism too in the press. But I think these more subtle ones, like you're pointing out with that headline, like the reliance on Hamas, that's what readers and viewers don't really understand fully. But it absolutely is one-sided, and I think that it's important to expose that.
And I mean, Steve, it's a really interesting sort of shaping of the narrative that's happening here among editors and journalists. One thing that we sort of see is this idea that, well, it's almost a competition between body counts, and that sort of determines who's in the right and who's in the wrong, which seems to be a bit, ghoulish and I think also wrong. But what is about the kind of groupthink among certain editors, certain journalists in the U.S. media? We see it here in Australia too, I got to say, that pushes everybody into this particular direction.
I think it's a combination of factors. I think that there is. It's interesting. You talk about like the woke journalists in American media, a lot of different sort of marginalized communities they would really be going and supporting. But when it comes to Jews, when it comes to Israel, don't get that at all. No, instead it's this sort of role reversal where, yes, the Palestinians, and it is, it's tragic what's happening to them, but who's responsible for that? We look at the Hamas control of that area, Hamas not letting their own people go to safer areas. We don't get that sort of coverage in the American press. And I think that a lot of this, like so many problems in the corporate press these days, goes back to social media, goes back to the incentive structure that's built in, where if they cover things in a certain way, in this case, maybe to what might be viewed as pro-Israel, they get yelled at by a couple hundred people on Twitter or X, and it sounds like it's this big deal. When you look at poll after poll, even most Democrats, certainly independents and Republicans, are supportive of Israel and absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself. We don't get that reflected in the press in a lot of instances because it's the loud but minority of people that are on social media that essentially bully these large news organizations into covering things a certain way.
But also, Stephen, I'm sort of curious about whether or not the training institutions that these journalists are coming out of, we spoke earlier in the program about anti-Semitism at elite university campuses, college campuses in America. Is the fact that they're coming out of, many of the journalists and editors come out of these institutions, they get so captured by the narrative that the Palestinians are the victims and the Israelis are the oppressors and colonists, that they can't sort of see past that frame that they've been given by their training?
I think there's definitely a part of that. Look, I am truly disturbed by what we're seeing on college campuses here, particularly in the biggest cities, the cities that are potentially, you would think of are the most woke, the most progressive. New York, San Francisco, what's happening at Stanford, NYU, Columbia, and then you go to the Ivies and Harvard and Yale, and I mean, you go right down the line. That's where a lot of these instances of of pure anti-Semitism are being shown, not from the students, not just from the students, but from the professors as well. So I do think that there is an element of that. I think that that is something that is being ingrained into them. But I also think what's happening here is we have this moment, October 7th, the largest terror attack, not just even of Israelis, but of Americans killed since 9/11. And that is this impetus for now to start to litigate centuries old, certainly since the 1940s, of what's happening in that region. Why is that all of a sudden the instance to do that? Well, it's because they just can't go and cover the story as it is, the October 7th and beyond. They have to go and start looking into the history and going into the entire backstory of the conflicts in order to get to a place where they feel comfortable covering it.
And Stephen, I was really curious about, stories we see out of like the New York Times about some of the reaction in the West. And we've seen this story over and over again about posters of the kidnapped Israelis getting torn down by people, activists, all sorts of folks. They framed the story thusly. They said how posters of kidnapped Israelis ignited a firestorm on American sidewalks. Again, as if there's just this sort of, both sidesism, or even, gee, look what those terrible, nasty posters did. They wound up igniting a firestorm.
It's fascinating to watch. You hear the biggest criticisms of the press from people from the left. Especially during the Trump years, it was always both sidesism, treating both sides the same, whataboutism, or just asking questions. These are the sort of criticisms that they got when it was covering Trump and covering the right, and we can't treat these people the same. Now all of a sudden, oh yeah, they're just asking questions. They're just looking at both sides of the story. Of course, and let alone the idea of free speech. Now all of a sudden, everyone's like, let's just let everyone speak freely. Yeah, well, where were you for the last 6-7 years when people were getting censored and pushed out of their jobs and off of college campuses? So yeah, I think that it's completely ridiculous. I think that another example of the American public seeing through it, because you look at the poll after poll, the American public is not behind this. How can anyone be behind treating the idea of taking down posters of young babies being held hostage by Hamas as a legitimate claim there? I mean, it's completely absurd, and I think that most of the audience sees through it, and the press just is not doing themselves any service by treating it like it's an actual story.
Steve Krakauer, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, and everybody go out and buy his book, Uncovered.